So I have to say this may be the best titled panel of the day. So hopefully they can all live up to their title. I think what you can expect from Paul, who we work with quite a bit at Passcode, one of the brightest and sharpest thinkers when it comes to writing and covering security matters. And these guys will be drilling down on some of the things we've talked about earlier. They'll sort of move forward Chris's talk on, okay, he's figured out you can hack a Jeep, and they're going to sort of look at, well, what are the implications as these things, knowing that, how do you take that knowledge and make sure other cars are safer? I'm not sure how they can compare, though, on their jump roping skills, so they can talk about that if they can beat Chris. But anyways, here's Paul, and I'll let him introduce the panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Oh, come on up, guys. Come on up. Thanks for that introduction. My first editor, Elizabeth Heichler, is in the audience, so she'll tell you that I'm 90% headline, 10% substance as a journalist. So thank you very much. This is our morning panel. Java's my co-pilot, security and connected vehicles. And just to, why don't we all take a seat, introduce who we've got on the panel. To my immediate left is Josh Corman, who is the Chief Technology Officer at the firm Sonatype, and also co-founder of I Am the Cavalry, which is kind of a nonprofit group, and we'll actually be talking a little bit about what Cavalry does, but some of you may be familiar with them. To Josh's left, William White, who is a senior scientist at the firm Security Innovation, a recognized expert on security, particularly in regards to connected vehicles. And right next to William, Chris Poulin, who's a research strategist at IBM's X-Force, another security and connected vehicles, M2M, machine-to-machine, and IoT expert, doing a lot of work at research at IBM right now, taking a look at IoT and connected cars. So Java is my co-pilot. I think the idea really was we've had two conversations today regarding connected vehicles, regarding connected devices, IoT devices, and then a presentation on car hacking and connected vehicle security. Both the policy side and the sort of practical security researcher's perspective. I think this panel is an opportunity to kind of tie them together. So I wanted to start off maybe just by going to my panel and, in a sense, getting an idea of context about sort of how we got to where we are today, where we've had a sort of wireless software-based attack against a connected car, and pose to my panelists the question, cars have been running software, have had software on board for decades, really. How did we get to a place in 2015 where that software is vulnerable to remote attacks? How did this happen? And Josh, I'll start with you.
So we all agreed we're going to try to have really fast answers. We're going to try. I think one of the things is, software is not new, but I think when no one was paying attention, we're over 100 million lines of code on some of these vehicles and climbing. And as we know from computer science, there's a certain defect rate per 1,000 lines of code. More problems. It's really that simple. That alone isn't enough to cause the fire. It's that we're also adding a lot of remote connectivity. So whether it's Bluetooth, near field, GPRS, 4G LTE Wi-Fi hotspot standard in all Chevy vehicles, the number and type and range of remote access technologies is really what changed the equation significantly. And this includes OBD2 ports that have a ton of functionality in whatever chips you want to do, because then they have unfettered access to the CAN bus upon which they sit. So you can even take an unhackable vehicle from your 1997 Civic and plug in an OBD2 port, and now you have a hackable vehicle. So we really weren't paying attention, and now we're in a highly prone state for the next several years.
OBD is onboard diagnostic. It's that little port under the...
It's what helps you do emissions tests.
Right.
And, I mean, just picking up on that, there's 100 million lines of code, and many of those millions of lines of code were written before the cars were networked at all. And when you're coming from an Internet of Things perspective, small devices, often cheap devices, often devices of short lifetimes, the design life cycles, the product life cycles in the automotive industry are just completely different from consumer electronics. And once you've got a system on the road that works, the wheels keep going around, it goes in the direction you point the steering wheel, there's a lot of incentives not to change that. So we've ended up with a lot of code that works really well when it's not on the network, and suddenly it's on the network, and transitioning from the code that worked fine when it was isolated to code that doesn't work very well at all in a hostile environment, while at the same time keeping these massive companies productive and occasionally profitable. That's a real challenge. That's how we've ended up where we are now, because the benefits, the consumer benefits, the use cases that are enabled by putting connectivity in the cars have been so attractive that cars are migrated to being networked much, much faster than the underlying software design was able to cope with, and much faster than the design processes in place that the car makers are able to cope with.
Okay.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because I was just going to, you took a little bit of my thunder and I was going to build on that. That's okay.
We should swap places.
I know. Well, it's good. That means we're all on the same page,
Yeah.
right? We all understand the problem set. Yeah. So, but I was going to say, as part of the problem is just the same thing we have in everyday software, which is that there's always this converse relationship between features and security, right? So, in one hand, we've built these things so that CAN buses, the critical control systems, are accessible to the frame systems, things that control the windows that are accessible to the entertainment system. They should be separate from each other, but consumers want things like, even the simple use case would be, if the wheels start slowing down, then you want the volume on your radio to go down. So you need to have the ability to measure wheel rotation, talk back to the entertainment system. And so it was just easier to say, well, we can use wheel rotation instead of saying, let's use something that's a little bit more accurate for perhaps maybe measuring the road noise. So we build features for consumers without thinking about the security implications, and then all of a sudden you end up with this amalgam of in-vehicle networks that ought to be separated in some senses. And I think it's a classic case also of the fact that we just don't build security in when we're building in functions to begin with. It's always after the fact. And if I were to go through and redesign a car right now, there's all kinds of things I would do architecturally, but I would also build in things like an IDS that would look for normal behavior within the car, even to the point where you recognize different patterns of behavior for drivers. So if I sit down in the seat and it knows my weight and it knows the key that I used, it knows that I usually don't press the brake. I like to drive in the breakdown lane and pass people because I'm a crazy driver, right? Or my wife drives a lot slower, then at least it would gauge what's normal for my behavior versus what's normal for her behavior. But that's way down the future. We haven't even thought that far. We've just said, let's make the entertainment system volume go down when the wheels slow down.
That would be a false positive problem that I would really like to see, right? The sort of when the in-car IDS, misidentifies the driver.
Hey, what do you do when you detect an anomaly? Do you just stop the car?
You
What's
log
the-
it,
Yeah.
Josh, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a lot of folks in the security research community who think we should take all of our quote-unquote best practices from PCI, from enterprise security, and catch up with cars. And I like to point out that our best practices aren't best practices. They don't work even in the intended use cases. So we spend $80 billion a year on enterprise security protecting a piece of plastic with a magnetic strip on it, and it's an abject failure. And the reason it's okay is because a 4% annualized fraud rate is acceptable loss. So I want to ask the audience, is a 4% incremental death toll in automobiles also an acceptable loss? We're not spending $80 billion on aftermarket security. As an analyst, we both worked at 451. There are 160 product categories with their own compound annual growth rates. I hope we don't have 160 product categories for car security. If I have to buy an antivirus every time I buy a car, I'm going to throw up. So there's something in between, but I would like to suggest that because the consequences of failure are mortal, because the consequences of failure are life and limb, we shouldn't simply aim to be as crappy as enterprise security. We should really be thinking about really defensible hardened designs, segmentation isolation. We really, this is the forcing function we needed to really think about what first principles drive more defensible secure outcomes and start there, as opposed to just try a whole bunch of stuff and hope for the best.
Yeah, I think you're right. We should not have an aftermarket
We will have an aftermarket.
for antivirus and stuff to stick in your car to protect yourself. I mean, I do think that it falls on the makers of all IoT devices to build security in. And by the way, when I said IDS, I did not mean take your IDS from your network, IT network security. I mean that auto manufacturers know what behaviors, they know what CAN bus interactions ought to be. So they should build something in there that defends against misuse. IDS is just a normal term that we all understand.
I have to say I get uncomfortable when you say we shouldn't have an aftermarket, because the alternative to having an aftermarket is getting it right first time. And I don't think that's something automakers or people have shown themselves to be very good at. Yeah, and it is this difficult balance to be struck between the robustness you get from diversity of providers and the robustness you get from having one provider who's really committed to doing it right. Right, and the model we've always had in the auto industry has been the OEM is committed to doing it right, and there's competition among OEMs. So if an OEM gets it wrong, you switch to a different car maker, and that's strongly baked into the culture. But as electronics become more modular, as people become more used to being able to upgrade everything else in their lives, I think the way that it is speculative, it is barely even security. But I think the way the automotive market has to go is in the direction of encouraging diversity of providers and ways of allowing providers to demonstrate that they're doing a good job, and away more from this monolithic OEM approach to the market.
I think it's a shared responsibility, just like most things, but we should very deliberately and very promptly define who owns which parts of the problem. So I look at the car OEMs, the car manufacturers themselves, as almost the operating system provider.
Yep.
And the operating system has to be capable of being instrumented and defended and responding to failure and noticing failure. There will always be an aftermarket, and I know one thing we talked about during prep is the reason this discussion, pardon the pun, gets wrapped around the axle is we have a deployed fleet that's sunk costs that can't be redesigned. And when you look at that, your only option is pretty much an aftermarket solution, a bolt-on. But for the future fleet that we haven't designed yet, we can do better built-in to reduce the ratio that requires bolt-on. So it'll always be a mix, but we want to have the appropriate placement of control and responsibility.
So you've got a lot, so kind of parsing what you said, you've got a lot of cars that have lots of software running on them that are designed or built within the last 10, 15, 20 years that are not connected vehicles. They don't have wireless cellular connectivity.
Until you add progressive.
That's right. That's right. Until you add progressive, or until you add or some other aftermarket product that's going to come along and say, oh, turn your dumb car into a smart car. Right. In fact, those products already are kind of coming on market now. So one question would be, what is the point at which you address that security risk that you're getting with the aftermarket smart car connectivity feature? Is there an easy way to, more or less firewall those types of features from the in-vehicle system, from the CAN and from the critical
it would be
vehicle
good if the information architecture in cars was such that there was an easy way, but right at the moment, as Chris was showing in his presentation before the break, just everything talks to everything, and everything talks to everything because in practice that's been the easiest way to keep the wheels going round. And so the OEMs, as you say, they're in charge of providing the basic platform that all of this runs on. The OEMs needs to bake in better separation between the different functionality as a kind of core property of the platform. If you don't do that, then you've got no real underlying protections against malware, against bad aftermarket software. So right at the moment, unfortunately, the answer to your question is no. There isn't an easy way.
I actually think that even for add-ons for older cars, it's the same problem. And I think, by the way, just going back to the original conversation, that I don't think there should be an aftermarket. I don't think consumers should have to buy antivirus for their car. Yes. So I don't mean that kind of stuff. An aftermarket in as much as you can have the OEMs buy it from another company, something that can provide security. That's a different kind of story. But if we, because that's regulation. Think about safe seat belts and airbags, right? Kind of the same thing.
Started aftermarket.
Exactly, but eventually, nobody wants to pay for them. If you gave me an option, and I'm a general consumer, I'm not going to buy a security feature for my car.
Right, but I mean, there's a difference between, and this may be a side issue, but there is a difference between you should have a quality solution for antivirus that comes with your car, and you should not be able to buy a better solution for antivirus afterwards, right? So are you saying the OEM should
That's a
be
good
in
point.
charge?
So there should be a base level. I agree.
Yeah,
the
yeah,
base level
exactly.
that the OEM is responsible for, and then you can buy.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
That's why I refer to this as an operating system model. So there's certain core hooks, capabilities, native abilities in the OS. You can have some security products that sit atop that or hook into that deliberately. But one way we put this in the Cavalry 1 year ago at DEF CON, we published a 5-star automotive cyber safety framework. We wrote an open letter through Reuters, in fact, Jim Finkel's around here somewhere. And we said, look, with as much empathy as we could, we said, you're masters of your domain, you've been making cars safer for 50 years. We're masters of our domain, and now that our cars are computers on wheels, our domains have collided, and we'll have safer outcomes sooner if we work together. Here's 5 critical capabilities you need to be ready for failure. And the casual way I say it to my neighbor is, tell us how you avoid failure, tell us how you'll take help avoiding failure, tell us how you'll capture and learn from failure, tell us how you'll have a prompt and agile response to failure, and tell us how you'll contain and isolate failure. Now, they have fancier names, and if we do the little turbo talk, I'll explain it in more detail. But to me, what we have to do immediately, now that we have connected vulnerable software, is you must be this tall to ride the Internet of Things standard. If you can't handle failure, you have no business putting people in danger. Now, this does not mean if you do these 5 things, you're safe. This is the starting line, not the finish line. And at the moment, especially if you read the Senator Markey hacking and tracking report, or you see the letter that came out of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about policy later, almost none of the cars can do even 2 of those 5 stars, even 2. So I don't want to talk too much about the bolt-on stuff, which is where all the heat and light is in the automaking industry, until we can have these foundational capabilities in the platform or OS.
One of the great things about these panels is these are folks who are actually talking to and working with auto manufacturers in a real way, in a consultative way, or an advisory way. And so they can speak a little bit to what the thinking is and also what the process is within those organizations vis-a-vis security and some of the issues we're talking about here today. One question I would have to that point is just help us kind of take us in a little bit into the sausage factory, as it were, and talk about how today software is designed and deployed on connected vehicles versus, my guess is if you go far enough back, these automakers were more or less writing all their own code. Then at some point they started working with supply chain partners to provide components. Chris talked about Harman as one of them. And then maybe potentially, and I know now, even internally for their own code, using both in-house code and open source components to develop features and capabilities. But talk a little bit about how the software is designed and built right now, and to the extent that there are security reviews going throughout that whole process. Are they happening? Is it or not? And where is there maybe room for improvement there? Because obviously the example Chris used of the OEM component from Harman being vulnerable, that was something that got missed.
So I'll start off, but so I've talked to some automakers about their design process, and they are not particularly open to exposing that process to sunlight, which is part of the problem with IoT in general, and and I think part of the auto industry in particular, because they've been doing business for 100+ years, sort of in a closed community. There's not that many automakers when you start looking at the diversity, when you look at the entire ecosystem. And they all kind of know each other. It's a little nepotistic, and they don't like outsiders. But so when we start talking to them a lot of times, we get a lot of generalities and not a lot of sunlight. In fact, I was talking to one automaker a year ago or so, and they were looking at new features they wanted to design in the car. So they sort of broke us up into 6 whiteboards, and they had people sort of cycle through and talk about different features. What's the financial benefit? What's the consumer benefit? How does it affect insurance and security? And at the end of it, I threw a bunch of security ideas as we went through, and they sort of boiled it down. And all they came back with is, yes, security is necessary, period. There was no detail. Everything else was nicely detailed. They understood how it worked.
How do they define security?
Well, exactly. There
No,
was
no,
nothing.
seriously.
Yeah,
not,
no, they
not
didn't.
rhetorical.
There's nothing. And I gave them a bunch of detail, and they came back with, we need to design security.
Yes, we need, it's that thing we need.
I found, in my experience, we've been working heavily with most of the supply chain, is when you say security, they hear privacy. And when you say safety, they hear validation of intended physical use. And guess what? All cyber safety is misuse, abuse, outside intended use. So there's a huge chasm in between the mental model of confidentiality and privacy and intended validated physical use. And all the stuff that scares the bejesus out of me is right here, and it's mostly ignored.
So can we come up with a definition that they could use?
Well, I think Josh did, and the thing that's nice about the 5-star approach is that it's not prescriptive in terms of actual mechanisms, techniques you need to use, but it's almost a process of mindfulness about things you need to bear in mind as you're developing your system. And when we say we need security, what we actually mean is whenever you're building something, you need to be thinking about these 5 things, each of which is a variation on what happens if this goes wrong. And
All systems fail.
all systems fail.
So if all systems fail is star 0, these are how you're ready for it. Right?
Yeah, and so, but may I put a bit more meat on the bones of the OEM software development? Although, of course, as Chris was saying, they are very close-lipped about exactly what goes on. But the interesting thing about the car industry is it's extremely hierarchical from the point of view of the supply chain. The OEMs acquire devices from tier 1s, the tier 1s acquire devices from tier 2s. Some OEMs produce very, very detailed technical specs that flow all the way down, and the supplier has to do exactly what the OEM says. Some OEMs have a bit of a lighter hand and provide functional specs. All the OEMs, especially in America, they're ultimately taking responsibility because, again, as we saw in Chris's presentation, it's Chrysler who've borne the cost of the recall. We don't know what retribution Harman had from Chrysler, but Chrysler are the ones in the headlines. They're the ones who bear the costs, and they're the ones who pass the requirements down to the suppliers. So OEMs have the ability to say to suppliers, you have to do security in this way, and it could be a mindfulness approach, or it could be a specific, you need to guarantee that all of your developers have taken a certain number of units of an accredited secure software development course per year, or something in between. And so the hierarchical system means that changes that are agreed on can be pushed down the supply chain pretty effectively. But yeah, right at the moment, we don't have visibility into how much that's happening.
Since we have Java in the title here, and since I started the Cavalry a little over 2 years ago, but I only started at Sonatype a year and a half ago. And one of the reasons I did so is I now get to be the custodian of the largest open source Java repository in the world, and I get to look at it like a global public health issue. And I wanted to see, when I was looking at the Internet of Things, it was mostly Java. And even if it wasn't Java, it was 90% third-party and open source. So we don't really write software anymore, including in cars, including Harman Kardon or Bosch. It's really assembled from existing parts. So the beautiful news is we can steal from Edwards Deming, who's like the godfather of Toyota supply chains, and lean and agile and DevOps as well. And we can start to treat software like a software supply chain. And we can start to scrutinize which parts are we using from which quality, high quality suppliers, high quality parts from those high quality suppliers, and trace which parts go where. Now, I'm taking that rubric from manufacturing and putting it into the DevOps culture through Ragged DevOps. That's my day job. But the way that we're working this into the automotive industry as well is the scary, scary news, and we don't go, pounding our chests at DEF CON about this, but we keep finding known vulnerable open source code in remote attack surfaces of most tier 1 suppliers in the automotive industry in the field that are prone and unpatchable. So they're known vulnerable, they're directly exposed, and they're unpatchable. And this makes me very, very nervous.
Unpatchable because there's no capability within the
Yeah.
deployed device for doing a firmware update.
That's exactly right, and that's one of the reasons we had to
Not that you
stress
couldn't
the
fix the
ability
code,
to
'cause you
you
could.
could rip out the device, you could
Right.
decommission the vehicle like we
Right.
did with the Pintos when enough people got scared. But there's no ready, easy way to, even when the USB key in some of these cases, for some of these ones.
Right.
So imagine the remote kill switch in every cop car, ambulance, fire truck in the country of Brazil, right? I mean, some of these things, they sole source their materials. And if there's a vulnerability in that kill switch, you could shut down traffic in the city, you could shut down any emergency response, it could be combined with the kinetic attack. I'm less concerned about financial abuse of these vulnerable cars. I'm much, much more concerned about ideological or military use of these vulnerable vehicles.
What's really funny is I see a lot of overlap between the types of problems you're seeing with like Soho routers, right? And connected cars or medical devices or whatever. I mean, it's the exact same problem where you can have a firmware like, oh, there was a company that issued a security update for a firmware that was 10 or 12 years old, you know, and affected hundreds of millions of devices because it was just everybody used it, you know. And you see the same thing happening just in different verticals, you know.
And you know, when you go to these security, I want to give a props to some of the OEMs though. There are some really passionate and mindful security people at nearly every car company, nearly every single one. They haven't had the executive air cover to do the right things. And they haven't had the market pressure to do the right things. So by raising the education level and by engaging public policymakers, we're trying to give them more air cover.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So and I think Chris Valasek said this as well. We tend to vilify the OEMs, the automakers, the tier one manufacturers. But the reality is it's a complex ecosystem, right? And they were designed at a time when they didn't think they were going to be connected to the internet in the first place. And Josh, you mentioned this earlier, that there's a time window too. So, you know, in the case of the GPAC, there was a Harman, the Harman unit was already 6 years old that was hacked. I think that's what you said, or something like that. So they make newer units now that actually have much better security in them. So,
in fact, as we talk to how do you securely implement updates, because there's a couple companies that have over-the-air updates, right? Tesla does it, and initially they weren't doing it securely. They were passing them in the clear. There was no cryptographic integrity either. They've gotten better. BMW does it over the air, and they were passing them in the clear, but they've gotten better. And as we looked at all the different over-the-air solutions, the newest Harman Kardon one after they bought a company called Red Band is one of the best ones, and their culture is one of the most forward-thinking ones. So it's very frustrating for me to see them poked at as this really reckless, irresponsible thing when that's an older model and an older design. And I think we need to have the nuance and maturity to say, let's not like tar and feather a particular OEM. In fact, I want people to start using the Harman Kardon package because they're a little further ahead for high integrity, secure updates that are reliable.
okay. I talked to a lot of the folks at the car companies that do quality assurance and all that, and they are really concerned, and they're working. You know, again, we don't know how far along they are because they don't expose that for a lot of reasons, right? They have legal liability issues they have to worry about, et cetera, et cetera. We own cars for 11.2 years or whatever it is. It's 5 to 7 years from inception to production of a new car. They're working on iterative model years, you know, instead of just net new cars from scratch. So there's a lot of reasons why it's taken a long time, and they really care and they really want to solve the problem. So we need to bear that in mind instead of just saying the automakers have made these wildly insecure things and they've connected in the internet and it's, you know, bad on them. That is not the case at all.
Okay. I want to ask one kind of policy question, and I want to go to the floor. You know, historically, the security safety improvements in vehicles have come by way of regulation rather than by industry initiative, or it started maybe with regulation and then the industry really embraced it. This is a complex area. There are many different agencies with jurisdiction over roads, over cars and transportation, Department of Transportation, NHTSA, et cetera, FTC potentially. Where is the leadership, what is the role for regulation in helping to shape direct action and direct investment within this very important vertical? And if we were to look out there on the horizon and say, okay, this is something that's coming along either legislatively or in terms of something, you know, noises that we're hearing from some particular agency, these are things you should pay attention to.
Yeah, well, I think this is something that DOT takes seriously. You know, there's a NHTSA which is the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. There's an NHTSA project on cybersecurity going on at the moment that currently is in an educational stage, and they're looking at can they put some kind of cybersecurity requirements in the FMVSS, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. A problem that you have in trying to address this problem with regulation is that regulation tends to be focused on putting together testable requirements, things that you can show that your car does this. While for security, as we've been talking, it's more about design philosophy and showing that your car defeats a set of known attacks is straightforward to do but unhelpful. Showing that your car was designed a particular way that minimizes the risk of as yet undiscovered attacks is very difficult to do, and it's virtually impossible to write in a regulation because regulation needs to set a level playing field that everyone's developing to. But that's really what we want people to do. So that's something that I know NHTSA and the guys from Volpe and everyone are really wrestling with at the moment. That clearly something needs to be done to improve the landscape, but what can be done with the tools that government has at its disposal is yet to be determined.
I'll be as quick as possible on this. The initial leadership attempt is right here from Senator Markey in Massachusetts and Senator Blumenthal, Connecticut, and they did a report on hacking and tracking in February. It's been followed up with a bill called the Car Spy Act instead of the Spy Car Act. It's got some good parts, it's got some problematic parts. If legislation ends up looking like PCI and it's a checklist of very brittle prescriptive inputs as opposed to measuring capacities or outputs, it could be very, very bad, and right now a lot of it's open to interpretation by NHTSA. I am more encouraged that the House side is doing, they just put out a letter of questions that highly resembles the 5-star, but they added really cool stuff in there as well, like, do you have a security officer responsible for cyber safety? So a belly button who can get fired is not a bad idea. So whether it's also not partisan. So the Senate committee that Markey feeds into, they don't love the bill either, but what they did say is we have to act before something really bad happens. And they had a very strong economic case. They said, Josh, the automotive industry is a double-digit part of the U.S. economy, and any crisis of confidence in the public in buying new cars or trusting their current cars would have a material impact on GDP. And said 1 in 9 Americans are employed in the auto industry, the parts industry, or the service industry. So this is not something we can kick the can down the road on. So there's a high motivation to measure thrice cut once kind of an idea. And the key is going to be what's the minimum required capacities to handle safety as opposed to you did a bunch of stuff. The one line I can't stand in the Markey bill, it got a little better, but it said any wireless capability must be subjected to a pen test. And I said, why just wireless? Pen tests are a trailing indicator. You're measuring failure, you're not preventing it. A pen test against which standard, because there isn't one. By whom, because there isn't a certification. And what do you do with the residuals? Because I seldom see a pen test that doesn't find something. So there's a lot of stuff that has to get worked out, but I think everybody in this group that hasn't read it should read it and comment on it and meet with Markey's team on it, because if we don't make the bills better, we're going to suffer with the unintended consequences of malformed ones.
And I think also just to pick on that one, given that the auto industry is such a large part of the economy, one thing we also need to be very careful about is putting enormously expensive measures in place that raise the cost of cars so that people don't want to buy them anymore.
I'll push back on that a
Okay.
tad, and then we'll go to questions, obviously. But what I keep hearing from the automakers is they have no problem doing these things. They just don't want to be the only one doing
Right.
it. So if there's a level playing field where everybody's got to do this, that's fine. They don't want to be punished for taking safety more seriously. And that's probably one of the reasons you needed laws to actually put seatbelts in the first place.
Yeah, and that's fair. But again, it speaks towards the type of regulation that we need, and it needs to be regulation that's focused on what's actually necessary and what can be put in place in a relatively light way, as opposed to requiring you to run a set of brittle, expensive tests that don't even get you what you want.
Okay. We have time for a couple questions. Emphasis on couple. Yes. One up here as well. But that and then her. Yep.
Ready, Mike?
So you made a comment about 4% fraud rate, but I'm going to act as the C-level person at an auto company, and you're going to come to me with, and you're talking about the no detail, you're going to come to me with a vulnerability. I'm going to ask you to quantify that risk to me, because the brake guy is going to tell me we have X number of failures per activities, and that's going to cause this number of accidents. How do you quantify the risk of a vulnerability so I know whether that's worth the implementation or not?
Well, I don't think anybody suggested we stop doing risk analysis. I think they're not robustly collecting inputs to do the math. And what they can't calculate is probability of exploitation, but what they can do, especially because these things are, when you have a flaw, it's not like a 1% of these might break. When you have a flaw, it's a class break. So you're really trying to calculate what's the odds of someone exploiting it. And then what Chrysler found out the hard way is they know how to do the math on recalls. There's a fixed rate times the number of vehicles to notify, to repair. There's a brand and reputational thing they can quantify as well. So when you start putting it in terms of recalls, one of the reasons Ford has now announced they're going to go to over-the-air updates, even though they resisted it in the past, was because they did the math, and an over-the-air update's way less expensive than a physical recall, and also it's a lot less brand damage. So risk analysis will still happen. We're just encouraging that you have options, and what we might do is publish a crisis management scenario with forks in the road, where if you're hacked on the news tomorrow and you have an over-the-air update, it's going to cost you this much. If you don't have it, it's going to cost you this much. It will all come down to dollars and cents. You can even put a price tag on a human being. They do. But the math right now is very fuzzy and missing some answers and variables.
Yes. How do you, aside from the security issue, how do you reconcile the difference in the lifespan between the average ownership of a car, which Chris mentioned is 11.2 years, and the average ownership of a computer? I don't want an 11-year-old computer. It's out of date. For example, I lease an Infiniti, and they recently contacted me for $175. We can update the maps in your car. I got Google Maps. I don't need this. So how would the audio industries reconcile that their technology is inherently going to be out of date on their computers in 3 years?
You know, it's interesting. There's a lot of confluence between two different types of industries. You know, the automotive industry, which is effectively a consumer industry, and the software industry. And one of the things that I've noticed that's kind of interesting is that I'm orthogonally approaching your question, by the way, is that the consumer industry is highly regulated, right? So and a lot of the liability falls on the OEM. The software industry is not highly regulated, and all of the liability falls on the consumer. And so when you bring those two things together, what ends up happening, right? We don't know yet. So the same thing is it's hard to make a comparison between commodity-based computers that consumers use and vehicles, because you're right, they are starting to look like computers in there. But there are a couple things. One, it's either going to generate a refresh of vehicles more quickly, which actually is good for the automakers, right? Because you want the newest thing. Incidentally, I have an 11-year-old car. I have no connectivity at all. I want it, but it just happens to be that I don't want to spend another 85 grand for another car at this point. So I'm waiting for Tesla to come out with Model 3 or something like that. Is really what it boils down to. So, but then there's going to be the people who want it now, and they're going to refresh it a lot quicker. And I think that's how they get newer features. But the reality is that the auto industry and a lot of the consumer-based industries understand how to support things for a long lifespan. The computers that go into them are going to, as they become more and more commodity-based ones, not things that come from tier one suppliers who understand that support life cycle, are going to have to start to adopt that at some point for that very reason.
Just looking at a policy lawyer in the room who knows cyber security. There's a lot of chatter that the thing that might finally introduce the completely absent software liability regime could be, the first kid getting run over by a self-driving car or the first software failure, because we really do have a true mashup between bits and bytes and flesh and blood now. We're kind of waiting for that trigger moment, and no one likes it because it'll be ugly and messy in the transition. But the ultimate end state is you should really put the liability and burden on the people who are in the best possible position to avoid it. And we do that in every single other aspect of your life. Doing that right now would be highly disruptive. So a lot of the policy things as intermediary steps, I know I'm helping with one particular piece of legislation that doesn't sound like it's car related, but in 30 seconds or less, it's called the Cyber Supply Chain Transparency Act. And it says any goods sold to the federal government, that includes cars, and medical devices, must provide a bill of materials of the third-party and open source parts used in its construction with their version numbers. Number 2, that list should not contain known CVEs in the NIST database without a justification. And number 3 is they must be patchable because future failure is inevitable. So something like that isn't liability. And if the liability does come and you've made patches available, then your burden and scope of risk ends when your customer failed to apply it. So it's a really scary chasm between current state and desired state, and we've got to be aggressively pushing steps and building that bridge from here to there.
That's true, but going back to the lifespan for a second, just because, so I agree with everything you say, but it's going to be a different paradigm for companies like Apple and Android who provide some of the head unit software, right? So they're not used to long life cycles for hardware and software. They're used to quick refreshes. And you might be able to refresh the software for a certain period, but what if the hardware no longer supports, the next, whatever's past ice cream sandwich or whatever's current? So how do they get to that state? And that's where they're going to have to adopt a 15 to 20 year life cycle for support for these things.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to end it with that. We're running over, but big hand for this panel, which did a great job.